Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for the live session with Jawahar Bhagwat. We'll be discussing the Ukraine crisis. Mr. Jawahar is an independent researcher on strategic affairs, national security, and the Arctic, particularly the Northern Sea Route. He completed his PhD in history from the University of Mumbai in December 2019 on India's involvement in the Arctic region. He is a visiting assistant professor at the Northern Arctic Federal University, named after M.V. Lomonosov in Russia. Jawahar has written a monograph on India's engagement in the Arctic, a historical perspective. He has published articles on strategic affairs such as India's energy policy and Afghanistan in EPW, and on national securities in the Force magazine. In addition, Jawahar has written several articles on the NSR in various scientific journals, including the Polar Record, focusing on the need for international cooperation to ensure the safety of navigation and the need for Russia to utilize international experience in the development of the NSR. Uh, Prior to his stint in academics as researcher, he served with the Indian Navy for over 25 years and commanded the nuclear submarine INS Chakra and the diesel electric submarines INS Shishumar and INS Shalki. He was also head of the training school for nuclear submarines at Vishakhapatnam. During his stint in the Indian Navy, he contributed to the formulation of the Indian Navy's maritime strategy and submarine doctrine. Jawahar has completed his MPhil in Strategic Studies from the University of Mumbai in 2014. The topic of his dissertation was India's Nuclear Doctrine, a Critical Reassessment. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Today we'll be discussing his latest article for the journal, which is titled Ukraine, the Anatomy of a Crisis. So, sir, on the 24th of February 2022, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, declared to the world that Russia was commencing a special military operation in the Ukraine. Could you tell us a little on how NATO and the US have contributed to this crisis? And could there have been a more non military or a diplomatic response from Russia on this issue?
Yes, I'd like to start with the 1990s when we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. At that time, there were several meetings between the US and the Russian side, and it was assured that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. However, this was not codified in any agreement, but several discussions took place in this regard. And this is actually the start of the present crisis can be traced back to the 1990s, because Russia understood that there would be no NATO expansion. However, there were 5 rounds of NATO expansion starting with 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, and then 2004 the next major expansion, that is the Baltic republics, got into the fold of NATO. In 2008, there was a meeting organized by NATO in which they declared that Ukraine and Georgia could also be prospective members of NATO. And this actually started the present crisis, because in August of that year, Russia and Georgia had a skirmish. Of course, this was resolved due to mediation, but as we are all aware, that South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which were autonomous republics under the Soviet Union, became breakaway regions, and they are only recognized by Russia and Serbia. So Russia gave fair warning of its intentions that Ukraine and Georgia becoming part of NATO would not be acceptable. This continued over the years. However, the next major crisis took place in 2014, when the democratically elected pro-Russian government was overcome in a so-called Maidan Revolution. But as the Russians stated, it was actually a coup engineered by the US and other forces, supported by the so-called endowment for democracy. Russia immediately retaliated and stoked the secessionist tendencies which were already there in Crimea. A referendum was held, and they voted to join Russia. This, of course, was as dutifully condemned by the West, but the fact is that Crimea was always a part of Russia and only gifted to Ukraine in 1954 by the then Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev for administrative purposes. Russia also supported secessionist tendencies in eastern Ukraine, that is the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. Mediation again kicked in, and in 2015 there was the Minsk Agreement. The Minsk Agreement stated that there would be greater autonomy for these republics and there would be an end to fighting. However, Ukraine chose not to implement this agreement, and the US and NATO did not persuade them to do so. So, progressively, we saw that the situation in these republics became worse, and to date, about 14,000 people have died. This went to the extent that the social support for people in these republics was stopped by the Ukrainian government. People from these republics started moving towards Russia, and Russia gave out about 1 million passports to people who were of Russian origin but were living in eastern Ukraine. So this is actually the whole. There's a whole prelude to this crisis. Now, I'm certainly not in support of Russia's actions in Ukraine as they have done it. But the fact is that Russia was a great power, is a great power, and they are not going to react the way other nations react, particularly when they think that their citizens of Russian origin who are Russian speaking have been discriminated against. Right. In December last year, Russia put forth a draft treaty which they gave, and in that treaty, they said that look, let us have mutually assured security, like what was there under the Cold War. And they requested them to go back to the agreement of 1997 between Russia and NATO, in which they clearly laid down that NATO would not expand into the territories which were part of the Warsaw Pact. Now it is a question for the US to answer that why is NATO expanding eastwards when the Warsaw Pact itself is no longer there? So what is the necessity to continue the kind of a Cold War, the kind of expansion when the threat is no longer existing as it was there in the case of the former Soviet Union and its allies?
So you're saying that there always was a history.
I would say that that is the primary reason. Yes.
There's a history
and that is
of
what has
this.
resulted in this present crisis.
Correct. So the Russia has tried to make this a better situation by offering treaties and asking for the NATO to not interfere. But this is so you could say that this situation was created where Russia was drawn into intervention through continuous expansion of the NATO and the hegemonic designs of the US, which precipitated the crisis. In your article, you state that the origins of the present crisis are located in the history of Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Could you tell us a little about what this history is?
Yes, actually, it goes back a long way to the 9th century. Kievan Rus, as it was called, is considered to be the cradle of the Eastern Slavic population. And initially the rule of this civilization or the influence of this civilization stretched from Kiev. In fact, the fourth ruler of this dynasty, the initial dynasty, was a person called King Vladimir. Also, coincidentally, as we have the Russian ruler and the Ukrainian ruler, also actually who are both Vladimirs, even though the Ukrainian ruler calls himself Volodymyr. So this ruler, in fact, introduced kind of Christianity from the Byzantine Empire into this land of Kievan Rus, as it was called. And thereafter, of course, it spread. The influence of Kiev reduced. Then the influence of Novgorod was there. Then finally, it came to Moscow. So
Correct.
throughout the period that this kind of a civilization, which extended right up to Poland, to of course Siberia, and in the south to the Black Sea, but there was no real state of Ukraine because the
Jawahar, we
controlling
lost you
authority
for.
were the Tsars. Okay, have you got me back again?
Few seconds. Few seconds. Could you just repeat from the controls spread to Moscow? Yes, yes. Just repeat yourself from Moscow became the center of
Yes.
power. After
So,
that, you have to repeat it.
so after the after the Slavs overcome the Mongol hordes headed by Genghis Khan, who ruled over this area for about 2 centuries, the seat of power shifted to Moscow. But they continued to control the entire area. Of course, there were always nationalist elements within Ukraine, but Ukraine did not really exist as a state. And the access to the Black Sea was actually won by the Russians in the late 18th century from the Ottoman Empire. The entire stretch from Odessa to Crimea, and in fact the city of Sevastopol, was created by the Russian Empire during the reign of Catherine II. However, we now fast forward to the revolution, and the revolution. One of the planks of the revolution, other than of course peace with Germany, was also on the plank of that they would give the various republics more status with respect to their nationalities. That means they would have greater respect for their languages, etc. So for some reason, we don't exactly know what reason, but even at the time of the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922, a part of this the Russian Empire, predominantly Russian-speaking regions, was given to Ukraine as part of their Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics. We don't know exactly the reason why this was done. Not Crimea, but the eastern regions of Ukraine, which are predominantly Russian-speaking. In fact, till 1934, the capital of Ukraine was not Kiev, but Kharkov. It was only in 1934 it shifted. Now let's move forward to 1954. And Crimea, which was part of Russia, because of its geographical location, due to other administrative reasons, and maybe due to Khrushchev requiring the support of the Ukrainian Communist Party in the struggle for power, gave this region to Ukraine. So it was actually given as a gift to Ukraine. However, control of Sevastopol, the naval base, was under direct control of Moscow due to its strategic importance. We now move on to 1991, where all the republics' nationalist tendencies again came to the fore, and Crimea declared itself independent. In fact, even before Ukraine declared itself independent in August 1991. That's a very interesting fact which is not talked about in the West and in the mainstream media. During the period of the 1990s, there was a constant tug of war between Crimea, Ukraine, and Russia. Ultimately, a compromise formula was reached in which it was more rights were given to the Russian speaking population there. And of course, it was agreed that Sevastopol would continue as a Russian naval base. So when we move forward to the 2014 crisis which took place, Russia perceived that the entire Maidan Revolution and the coup that followed of overthrowing a democratically elected, albeit pro-Russian government, was engineered by the US, and they reacted in the way that probably that they thought was fit. Now, if we look at Kosovo, were secessionist tendencies encouraged by US and NATO? Yes, they were. So if it was encouraged then, why are different standards being applied to Russia? And the US, in fact, justified this to the UN court that it is acceptable for any people to secede. So this is all the prelude to this crisis. Thereafter, we had the non-implementation of the Minsk agreements, a kind of a genocide being conducted in Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, where the Russian-speaking population was being discriminated, which is about 40% of the population in each of these republics. And
What
therefore,
exactly
all
was
this
part
is
of
part
the
of
Minsk
history. We
agreement?
can
What exactly was part of the Minsk agreement?
the Minsk agreement, the Minsk agreement stated that there would be greater autonomy. They would be actually treated as autonomous republics. There would be an end to. There would be an absolute ceasefire, and there would be language rights for the peoples in these
regions.
republics.
Right.
However, what has happened subsequently is that Ukraine have initiated a language law which discriminates against Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, which was not the case when the Soviet Union was there. When the Soviet Union was there was Russian and there was Ukrainian, and both were taught in schools. So this is another point of this is a major point which again the Russians showed angst against, is that why are you trying to be a one people, and why are you trying to drive a wedge of brotherhood against people who have always lived in harmony for thousands of years. So Russia treats Ukraine very much as part of their turf, just like they treat Belarus.
Right.
So it would be wrong to say that they treat it like Georgia or any other republic. It's not the case, because they consider that they are all one people, and in fact they have one church. But unfortunately, again, the nationalist elements in Ukraine created another church after Ukraine formed, and this is again created also an issue wherein they have a Ukrainian church now and a Russian church, whereas the church was always combined earlier.
Right, the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yes. So now you
Could you
have
just
a
tell us
Ukrainian Orthodox Church which is separated.
like more recently, how did the situation precipitate?
I think the situation could have been highly avoided if the US had been more cognizant of the red lines which the Russians had been stating over and over again. And here I would just like to quote the current CIA director. Okay,
Right.
he's William Burns, who in 2008 was the US ambassador to Russia. He's in fact the first serving a diplomat to become the CIA director. And he wrote in a memo entitled Niet means Niet, that is, no means no, Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. And I quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for Russia. And I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russia's interests. And this was in 2008 when he wrote this memo, that is after the NATO declaration, in which they stated that they are open to Ukraine and Georgia joining. I would again go back now further than that to 1998, 10 years before. George Kennan, an astute US diplomat who was actually the architect of the US containment policy towards the Soviet Union, he also expressed in different words the same thing. So if Biden had in December taken cognizance of this draft treaty, which was put on 17 December, and said in no uncertain terms that Ukraine would not be a part of NATO and we will start negotiations on this treaty, I don't think this situation would have occurred. Another thing, of course, here we don't have access to Russian intelligence inputs, but already there is fair amount of discussion on the internet, and I just saw today a question which was put forth by a senator to Victoria Nuland, who's the Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, regarding the biolabs, which are supposedly funded by the Pentagon and existing in Ukraine. Now,
Huge security
Victoria
issue.
Nuland, in reply to the senator's in reply to the senator's question, states, "We are concerned about this and we do not want them to fall into Russian hands. And we are actively in concert with our Ukrainian partners in this question." Now tell me, why would the US be interested in biological research labs, as they now call it, of another country? Does it make any sense?
Absolutely.
If Ukraine has got something going, they have got no business in it. And why should they be even concerned if it falls into Russian hands? Do you think Russia is such a weak or feeble nation that they need to find out what is, get some research benefit from that? Certainly not. I think it's much more serious than that. If there is a fair amount of discussion on the internet regarding this, and the Russian military spokesperson has already made a statement regarding this, regarding these labs, and also the fact that the U.S. Embassy has destroyed documents related to these labs. Now, these labs are funded directly by the Pentagon, and this information is available on the net. The documents are available. This is one point. The second point, of course, which is not confirmed, it's only based on Russian sources, according to them, that the Ukraine had already started a nuclear weapons program, and in which they started getting help from the US side. However, this is not confirmed. This is only based on Russian sources and therefore would need to be verified. And that is why one of the first military objects which they seized or which they were concerned about is the Chernobyl atomic power station, which is closed down. But near that, supposedly a research facility was set up by the Ukrainians to start their program, in which they, according to the Russians, they got some designs or some help from the American side and certain amount of plutonium also, which is of course necessary for making weapons. And now Ukraine, right. if we recall, Ukraine was very much an industrial base of Russia, whether it is producing ships, whether it is producing aircraft, whether it is being part of the industrial facilities for making nuclear reactors. So it's not really difficult for Ukraine, it's not like Iran, okay, to go into a nuclear weapons program should they want to. So this also cannot be discounted as to what intelligence the Russians had, or what prompted them to do this. Because as I said in my first article in early Feb, I think it is unlikely an invasion, but it happened. So what prompted them to take that step? Right. Because to this date, they have always been cautious in their approach. Even the skirmish between Russia and Georgia it happened only for 5 days. So what has prompted them to take this step, when obviously they would have thought about it and sanctions would come their way? And of course, the main reason, of course, is the competition between the US and Russia as natural gas exporters, and we now see that Nord Stream 2 is dead. So we are going to have a major realignment. Russia is also going to be affected, no matter what they say, by these economic sanctions. So the world has become topsy-turvy, I would say.
Sir, I think the sanctions were exclusive of Russian oil and gas. Is that true?
Yes, but yes, that was true initially. What you're saying is correct. Okay. But only yesterday or day before, the Americans have now said that they would sanction Russian oil and gas also. And they are now trying to put pressure on the Europeans to join. Now, the Europeans are, unfortunately, if they join, it will be suicidal. Why? Yeah. Because 25% of European oil oil and 40% of European gas is from Russia. We already saw last year that because of their own policies towards renewable energy and storing minimum amount of natural gas, we saw a hike in their natural gas prices. They went through the roof and they caused a lot of hardship to common people. In fact, the price of gas went up by 4 times. So now with this, if they get influenced by this American factor, prices are going to go up even further. So are the Europeans ready for it? They have made grand statements that we will reduce our dependence to Russian oil and natural gas to the minimum in a year. But is that feasible? Is it viable? And who's going to
So
pay
I
for it?
think
That's the question.
so.
Will the people accept it?
There's huge repercussions around the world because of this invasion. So can you tell us how do you see this situation resolving? It's already been 12 days or so. What, according to you, is the best path forward for all parties involved, whether it is Ukraine, Russia, the EU, or other smaller countries bordering Russia who may similarly become battlegrounds for conflict among the great powers?
Personally, I'd like to talk about the smaller countries. I
Right.
think these smaller countries don't have anything to worry about. Yes, they would be
Okay.
concerned, but if we go into history, if we go into what President Putin states and what he does, he's a person who finally does what he states. And though he said that the fall of the Soviet Union or the disintegration of the Soviet Union was a geopolitical catastrophe, he has also said that it he doesn't think it's a good idea for the former Soviet Union to get together again because of new geopolitical and geoeconomic realities. So, and Russia views the other republics in a very different way as compared to Belarus and Ukraine, and that's simply because they are one Slavic race. They were one people, they were one Russian Empire, and the present political leadership in Russia actually draws its kind of glory from the past, from the Russian Empire. But that does not mean that they are expansionists.
Okay.
It is simply because, according to me and according to a lot of Western experts also, here I'd like to quote John Mearsheimer also, who wrote a famous article in 2014 itself, Why Ukraine is the West's Fault, in which he said that this has all been caused by liberal delusions of hegemony. And if people in the West had simply listened to what Russia and particularly Putin was saying, starting off with the 2007 statement in the Munich Security Summit, this wouldn't have happened. So smaller countries, I don't think they need to worry about that. They are already part of NATO. Russia did not object to their being a part of NATO. Next, let's move on to Ukraine. Ukraine needs to realize that NATO are not going to send their forces. They are going to send defensive equipment like anti-aircraft missiles or anti-tank missiles and the smaller range of weapons, but they are not going to get involved. Nobody wants to get involved in a direct war with Russia. In fact, let's talk about what the influential think tanks like the Atlantic Council and the RAND Corporation are saying. They predicted that this conflict would take place, and now they are saying that the US should support counter insurgency. Can you imagine that we are faced with this situation and they want to create counter insurgency with the help of foreign mercenaries, just like they did in Afghanistan? They're living in a fool's paradise because Russia is not Afghanistan. Russia views Ukraine as part of its own sphere of influence. It's like, for example, tomorrow, if Russia had great relations with Mexico or Canada, and started putting their missiles there or sending their military personnel there to exercise or to train their personnel, Would it be acceptable for the US? Let's go to the Monroe Doctrine of 1954, which said that the US would not tolerate any external powers influence in the Western Hemisphere, and that created the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is not said in the media is that the Cuban Missile Crisis was a quid pro quo. NATO agreed to withdraw its missiles from Turkey. And Russia said, yes, if you withdraw from there, I withdraw from here. So that's what happened. But that part is not talked about. What is talked about is only that the Russians or the Soviets wanted to put their missiles there. So that's the thing. Now, when we talk about Ukraine, they need to realize that they are cat's paw. So it's up to them whether they agree to their neutrality status, not to be a part of NATO. I think these would be major conditions which the Russians would be satisfied with, and of course, not allowing the Nazi elements to be part of their government. Regarding them being a part of EU, I think the Russians should compromise on that aspect, because that is an economic aspect, and it would be in Russia's interest also to revive its relations with the EU. So I think there has to be a compromise on that aspect. They have to be flexible and not so rigid in their approach. Regarding other countries, I think they need to think about their involvement in the financial system, in the US controlled financial system. We already saw what happened to Iran. And how has Iran escaped from that? By having agreements with China and Russia. They have a very long-term agreement with China, and China has got them out of their mess. Even when we talk about Russia, 44% of Russian-Chinese trade is in yuan. 15% of their foreign currency is in yuan. Okay, so we have a situation here where it's actually an economic war where a central bank's assets have been frozen. What they did to Iran and what they did to Afghanistan, which we may call minor countries without being sounding chauvinistic, they have done to a G20 country. So it's like war by other means, and therefore I think countries need to think about. India had a problem in buying the S-400 missile system from Russia because of the financial system. How would they pay for it? So I think countries need to think about it, because if they want their foreign policies to be independent, they certainly need to be less dependent upon the dollar. And the US economy is a hundreds of $trillion debt economy. The US exists because of the financial system, because everybody needs to trade in dollars. It's simply because of that. So other countries certainly need to think. They need to think about how they are going to how have their foreign exchange currencies in other currencies which they think are more stable. They also need to think about their energy resources, and that includes India, because India is heavily dependent on various countries for their energy resources. And India needs to look at long-term contracts with more stable sources of energy supply. And here we have a lot of energy coming in, but from various sources. And here we are trying to do the balancing act of pleasing US, pleasing Russia. But why we need to think about why Europe takes its gas from Russia. Because simply that liquefied natural gas is more expensive than natural gas, which is supplied through pipelines from Russia. It's simply a case of economics.
Right.
So, having strategic reserves and having more diversified contracts with countries that are more stable and would help us out in times of difficulty is what we need to look at.
So finally, Ukraine, what they have to do is they have to rethink the entire NATO strategy, and other countries also need to rethink their energy policies of whether they can make more stable long-term agreements. So, and also you're suggesting that the solution to this is that Russia
Definitely.
compromises on the EU, on Ukraine's aspirations to join the EU. Right. Thank you so much for giving us such a detailed insight into what is happening in between the Russia and Ukraine and the different reasons, historical reasons for why these things are happening. Also for giving us an outlook of how this conflict can be resolved in the future through dialogue. We would like to ask the audience to please read the entire article we've discussed by heading to our website. I'll be sharing the link. Please subscribe to EPW to get access to this article. Digital access to the website starts at rupees 770 for a year. You can also buy a hard copy of the Economic and Political Weekly, the 5th March 2022 issue. You can read this article and other research-based articles on current affairs. Physical copies are available at newsstands and can also be ordered online on Amazon. Thank you so much for joining us, Jawahar. We really enjoyed the conversation we had.